The field stretched out beneath a January sky, white and hard as bone. Wind cut across the barren ground, dragging dust and the grind of wagon wheels along the frozen road. At the end of that road, a small house stood alone. Thin smoke rose from the chimney, trembling in the cold. The door burst open. A woman in a gray shawl rushed out, into the dark, 2 heavy buckets swinging from her hands. She knelt in the frozen mud, clawing at the earth, with bare fingers, until they went numb and bled. She dug. Heaved the wet soil aside. Dug again. Her breath came out in white clouds. Then the blade caught. A dark stain spread across the bottom of the hole, widening, faster than the thirsty ground could swallow it back. She pressed 2 fingers into it. Cold. Wet. Rising. A whole town had laughed at her gamble. Signed their names to that verdict with their laughter. But the thing rising from the earth, the thing that had waited 30 years, no one thought to ask whom it belonged to. And the wind had only just begun to blow. The water didn't look like anything. Just mud. Just a low silver wink at the bottom of a scraped-out hollow that the county map still called Sutter's Waste. That was the name on paper. Everyone else called it something crueler, when they thought Winnie Sutter wasn't listening. But the wagons kept coming. They came up the rutted track in a long dust-choked line, axles groaning, cattle bawling for water they hadn't tasted in a week. Men who used to look past her in the mercantile now sat straight-backed on their wagon seats, hats already off, sweat cutting pale trails through the grime on their faces. They watched her the way men watch weather, waiting to see which way it would turn. They didn't know yet. Couldn't know. That the real verdict on Winnie Sutter had already been handed down, months before, by something with no voice at all. The land itself. 8 months earlier, the town's verdict had come, with a voice. Loud. Amused. Final. Larkspur County, the dead heart of January 1880. The wind that day had teeth in it. It came down off the ridge, and cut straight through wool coats, straight through the crowd gathered around what had, until that morning, been the Garrity place. After the gavel fell, it would belong to whoever had the coldest hands, and the least mercy, which in Larkspur County usually turned out to be the same man twice a season. Winnie Sutter stood at the back. Gray shawl. Gray sky. She'd worn the shawl, so long the color had stopped being a choice, and started being a fact about her, the same as her height, the same as the 2 children waiting at home, with a neighbor woman, who kept glancing at the door. She wasn't there to bid on land. She knew better than that. She'd known better then, that since the morning her husband's coffin went into ground so frozen it took 3 men, and a pickaxe to open it. Up front, on an overturned crate, that passed for a stage, stood Cornelius Vane. Banker. Auctioneer. A man built like good tailoring, smooth where it should be smooth, sharp where it needed to cut. His voice carried across the yard like it was doing the crowd a favor just by existing. The plow. Vane called. Good iron. Barely 3 years worn. Sold. The house lot. Sound roof, knew well. Sold, and sold well, because everyone in Larkspur County knew a new well was worth fighting for. Because that's what a drought teaches a place, before the drought even arrives. It teaches people to smell water years in advance. Which was why nobody was smelling anything, from the sorry huddle of animals penned at the far end of the yard. And last, Vane said. He didn't even lift his voice for it. Lot 107. The pigs. 80 of them, if you trusted the tally sheet. 80 walking arguments against trusting the tally sheet, because what stood in that pen looked less like livestock, and more like the idea of livestock, sketched by someone who'd only ever heard a pig described second-hand. Skin stretched paper-thin over hip bone. Snouts caked with frozen mud they'd been chewing out of sheer desperation, because desperation doesn't know the difference between dirt and dinner. Somebody in the crowd laughed. Short. Ugly. The kind of laugh that isn't really about the joke at all. 80 head, Vane said, smiling like the joke was his to tell. A bit lean from the winter. Good spring pasture, they'll fatten right up. Silence. Except for the wind. Except for one hog coughing somewhere in the pen, a wet, ragged sound that made two women near the front turn their faces away, because some sounds a body simply refuses to stand and listen to twice. Who'll start the bidding? Nothing. Come now, gentlemen. A fine foundation for a new herd. They're half dead, Cornelius. A voice from the crowd, flat, practical. Costs more to bury 'em than to buy 'em. Vane's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. A small recalculation, quick as a bird changing direction mid-flight. He scanned the crowd, and his gaze slid past Winnie the way a hand slides past a doorknob it already knows won't turn. Which was its own kind of insult. Being so far beneath consideration that a man's eyes didn't even snag on you on their way past. Because that's what a town does to a woman alone. It doesn't hate her. Hating takes energy, and effort, and a willingness to keep thinking about the thing you hate. It just stops seeing her. Lets her fade into the furniture of the place, the same as a chipped pitcher or a gate that never quite latches right. $25. The words came out of Winnie before she'd finished deciding to say them. Quiet. Level. But the yard was so still that quiet carried like a shout, the way a dropped pin carries in an empty church. Every head turned. She felt it land on her all at once, the weight of 40 pairs of eyes arriving at the same conclusion in the same breath. $25. Everyone in that yard knew exactly what $25 meant to Winnie Sutter, because everyone in that yard had watched her scrub other people's linens for 2 years to save it. Watched her carry Caleb on one hip, and a basket of somebody else's wash on the other, down the same road, in every weather, for 2 years running. Watched, and said nothing, because watching costs nothing, and saying something might. Vane's smile curdled into something almost gentle. Almost. The widow bids $25, he said, and he pitched it out over the crowd like he was doing them a service, sharing a good joke, before it got away from him. $25 for 80 starving hogs. A woman alone. He let that sit. Let it do its work, the way a good preacher lets silence do its work, after a hard verse. Do I hear a better offer? Nobody moved. Going once. Somewhere behind her, a man muttered something to his neighbor, and the neighbor snorted, quick, ugly, gone as fast as it came. Going twice. Vane's eyes found hers again. Held there. And in that small triangle of a smile, Winnie read the whole sentence he wasn't saying out loud. That he already knew how this story ended. That he'd read enough of them to know the shape a ruined woman takes, months before she takes it. Sold, he said. To the widow Sutter. For $25. May God have mercy on your pantry. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was tired. It was the sound of people who'd done the arithmetic themselves, 100 times, in 100 bad winters, and knew with the bone-deep certainty of people who'd buried children, over less, that this was not a story, with a happy ending. It was the sound of her foolishness getting a second opinion, and the opinion agreeing, without much debate. She counted out the coins. Worn silver. A few dollars in bank paper, that Vane's own institution had issued, which struck her, even then, even distracted as she was, as something close to a joke aimed squarely at her. Paying a banker in the banker's own script for the privilege of owning 80 dying animals nobody else would touch, with a 10-foot pole. She didn't look up while she counted. Didn't give him her eyes. Because if she looked at him, he'd see it. The fear. The arithmetic already running behind her face, cold and relentless. 80 animals. No grain. No money left over for grain. And 2 children at home, who needed shoes, before they needed anybody's sympathy, hers least of all. She was ruined. She knew that the way she knew her own name. And still her hand didn't shake counting out the coins, and that, at least, she gave herself credit for, walking away from that crate with her chin exactly where it had been when she arrived. Here is the thing nobody in that Yard knew to ask. Why had Cornelius Vane pushed the Garrity sale through in the dead of winter, when any decent banker waits for spring, waits for a man's crop to fail twice instead of once, before he takes the roof from over his children's heads? Why had the foreclosure notice arrived on the coldest week of the year, timed like a blade meant to land, while a man was too weak, with cold and worry to parry it? Nobody asked? Because nobody knew there was a question worth asking. But Vane knew. Vane had known for months, ever since the surveyor's report crossed his desk, a dry little document full of numbers, that meant nothing to anyone who couldn't read water the way water reads itself. Ridge lines. Runoff patterns. A single phrase buried 3 paragraphs deep in language built to be skimmed past, about subsurface drainage collecting in the low ground west of the county road. The low ground, which the surveyor's map, if a man squinted at it the right way, marked as adjoining 3 parcels. The Garrity place. The old Ansel claim, abandoned these many years, its cabin long since sunk back into the earth, and a scrubby 15 acres of clay and thistle that everybody called worthless, because everybody who wasn't Cornelius Vane had never learned to read a map the way he had. He wanted all 3 parcels. Had wanted them for 2 years, quietly, patiently, the way a man wants something he intends to have regardless of how long it takes to arrive. The Garrity foreclosure was step 1, and it had gone exactly as planned, right up until a woman in a gray shawl, with a dead husband's savings, walked off, with 80 dying hogs he'd fully expected nobody in that yard to want. Which was an irritation. A small one. Barely worth a second thought. Except that when he watched her walk away from the auction yard that afternoon, coins gone, pride intact, spine straight as a fence post in a wind that would have bent most men clean over, something in Vane's calculation shifted by a single, precise degree. Not concern. He didn't do concern, not for widows, not for anybody whose ledger balance sat below a certain line. Something closer to curiosity. The kind a card player feels when an opponent he'd already dismissed makes an unexpected bet, small enough not to matter, strange enough to remember. He filed it away. Went back to his ledgers, before the crowd had even finished dispersing. Because that's what men like Vane do with the things that don't concern them yet. File them away. And wait. Because waiting for a man like that has never once cost him anything. The walk home took the better part of the afternoon. 80 hogs, if you could call the shuffling procession that word without embarrassment, moved with the slow drag of creatures that had forgotten what walking was even for. Winnie went behind them, with a switch she never once raised, tapping bony rumps, not to hurt, only to remind. There's a forward. Even when forward looks like nothing at all. Men watched her pass from their fields. Watched a woman alone herd a rattling parade of bones up the frozen track toward 15 acres that wouldn't grow decent weeds, let alone decent hogs. They shook their heads. Went back to their work. The entertainment was over, and there were chores waiting, and a woman's ruin, however satisfying to witness, from a safe distance, didn't put supper on anybody's table but her own. Her land, when she reached it, looked exactly the way she remembered it looking every single day since she'd bought it. Which is to say, like a mistake somebody had gone to the trouble of building a cabin on top of. 15 acres, rust-colored, thistle-choked. No well. Only a temperamental cistern that caught rain, when rain felt like falling, which this winter it mostly hadn't. The soil a thin, resentful skin stretched, over hard-pan clay, that broke plow blades, and broke men's patience faster than it ever broke open for a crop worth the name. It was all she'd been able to afford, after the funeral. After the doctor's bill, that came due even, though the doctor hadn't managed to save anything. After 2 years of other people's laundry had bought her exactly enough money to purchase the worst piece of ground in Larkspur County, and now, apparently, to purchase 80 animals to go with it. Caleb met her at the fence, coat unbuttoned because he'd run out, without thinking, 7 years old, and already so used to bad news, that his face didn't do much of anything, when he saw the pen filling up with skeletal hogs. Mabel rode the hip of Ruth Odell, the neighbor woman who'd minded them, for years old, unbothered, sucking her thumb, and watching the strange parade, with the flat curiosity of a child, who hadn't yet learned that some sights were supposed to worry a person. Ruth took one look at the animals, and did not manage to hide her own face fast enough. "Land sake, Winnie." "I know. $25. I know, Ruth." Her voice came out flat. "Steady." The voice you use when the alternative to steady is something you cannot afford to spend in front of your children. Ruth didn't say anything else. Just handed Mabel over, gathered her own shawl tighter against the cold, and walked back down the track, without looking behind her, because there are some situations a neighbor doesn't know how to stand and watch, and this, plainly, was one of them. That night, after the children were down, Caleb pretending to sleep, watching her through slitted eyes the way 7-year-olds do, when they've decided the adults are keeping something from them, Mabel actually asleep, thumb in mouth, unbothered by the entire collapse of her mother's finances, because 4-year-olds have the mercy of not understanding arithmetic yet. Winnie sat at the small table, with a stub of pencil, and did the sums. 80 hogs. A sack of cornmeal. Half a bushel of withered potatoes. Wild onions, if she was willing to walk 2 miles to the creek bank, and dig with her bare hands in half-frozen mud. Food for herself, and the children, maybe a month, if she stretched it thin as thread. For 80 hogs, it wasn't even a single meal. She set the pencil down. Picked it back up. Set it down again. Because the numbers didn't care how she felt about them. That was the whole cruelty of numbers. You could beg them, cry at them, pray over them like they were a saint's relic in a glass case, and they would sit there being exactly what they were. Cold. Fixed. Unmoved by anything a person had to offer. She looked at the door. Beyond it, in the dark, 80 animals were enduring a cold they had no fat left on their bodies to fight. A woman alone, Vane's voice said in her memory, smooth as poured oil. It hadn't been an observation. She understood that now, turning it over at midnight, with the fire burning low. It had been a verdict, delivered in front of the whole town, and the whole town had signed their names to it, with their laughter. For one terrible stretch of minutes, sitting in that cold cabin, with her children asleep behind a thin curtain, and 80 dying animals rattling in the yard, Winnie let herself feel the entire weight of it. No husband. No family within 400 miles. No neighbor she could ask for a cup of flour, without that neighbor's eyes doing the arithmetic too, and finding her wanting, and filing the number away for later, the way people in small towns file everything away for later. She let herself feel it. For exactly as long as it took to feel it all the way through, and not 1 minute longer. Then she stood. Because sitting in it wouldn't feed a single mouth. Went to the door. Opened it into the cold. The hogs were huddled against the lee wall of the cabin, a miserable gray mass, barely stirring. Except one. A sound near the edge lifted her head, tested the black air, with a long trembling snout, ribs showing like the slats of a washboard somebody had left out in the rain too many winters running. It was such a small thing. A hungry animal sniffing at nothing. But there was something in the gesture, some stubborn, animal insistence that the next breath might carry something worth having, that made Winnie's throat close up tighter than the cold ever could. She'd made a bargain, standing in that auction yard. $25 for 80 lives nobody else would take responsibility for. She would keep it. Not because she believed it would work. She didn't, not that night, not with the sum sitting on the table behind her like a debt collector who'd already let himself in, and made himself comfortable. She'd keep the bargain, because the alternative was to become the kind of woman who made promises to dying things, and then let them die anyway, for the sake of her own comfort, her own exhaustion, her own convenient excuses. And she was not, whatever this county thought of her, that kind of woman. Whatever else January had taken from her, it hadn't taken that. She was up before the sun. A bucket in each hand, breath fogging in the dark, she walked away, from town instead of toward it, up into the wooded hills, where the ground hadn't yet given up its winter secrets to anybody. dug for cattail roots in marsh mud, so cold it burned straight through to bone. Stripped bark from slippery elms, with hands that went numb, and stayed numb for the better part of an hour. Gathered acorns the squirrels hadn't found, or had found, and rejected, which she chose, deliberately, not to think too hard about. She came back at dusk. 2 buckets of something that could, with real generosity of spirit, be called food. She boiled it into a thin gray slurry in the iron pot out back, the steam rising bitter and earthy into air, so cold it seemed to freeze the smell itself in place, hanging over the yard like a promise nobody had quite finished making. The hogs came at the scent like it was salvation walking on 4 legs. Weak grunts. Shoving snouts. The desperate music of animals, who understood, on some level below thought, that something was finally happening to them, that wasn't just more cold. It wasn't enough. She knew, ladling the thin mash into hollowed log troughs, that it wasn't enough. Because nothing she could carry in 2 buckets was ever going to be enough for 80 mouths. But it was something. And something, when you have nothing at all, is the entire difference between a beginning and an ending, and Winnie had decided, somewhere around midnight the night before, that she was going to be the kind of woman who noticed that difference. Days folded into each other after that. Rise in the dark. Forage. Haul. Boil. Feed. Fall into bed too tired to dream, which she counted, privately, as a mercy, because dreaming, lately, had a way of turning cruel. She learned the hills the way a person learns a language out of necessity, fast, imperfect, driven by hunger instead of curiosity. Which roots held sustenance, and which held nothing but bitterness. Which mushrooms wouldn't kill a hog, or her children, or herself, which mattered more than she liked to admit some mornings. She stopped seeing the landscape as scenery and started seeing it as a larder, which was its own kind of loss, because a woman, who used to notice how the light came down gold through bare branches, now only noticed whether the ground beneath those branches was worth the trouble of digging. The town saw her sometimes, far off, a small bent figure working the tree line, with a borrowed spade in freezing mud, and they pitied her the way people pity a slow-motion accident they've already decided they can't do anything about. It confirmed everything they already believed about the world's order. About what happened, in the end, to women who made foolish bargains out of foolish grief. By the end of the first week, the hogs had stopped losing weight. They hadn't started gaining it either. She was holding starvation at bay, with a single fraying thread, and the thread was her own strength, and her own strength was giving way faster than she wanted to admit, even to herself, alone, in the dark. In the ache that had moved from her back into her hips. In the way her hands had started shaking a little, when she lifted the water buckets, just a small tremor, nothing anybody watching would notice, except she noticed. In the hollow feeling behind her ribs, that she recognized, distantly, as her own hunger, because she'd been feeding the children first, and the hogs second, and herself, if there was anything left over, which there mostly wasn't, dead last. She was going to lose. Not dramatically. Not all at once, not in some single terrible night she could brace herself against. She was going to lose the way exhausted people lose. Slowly. Quietly. One missed meal at a time, until one gray morning she simply wouldn't have the strength left to lift the buckets, and 80 animals, and 2 children would be standing there, waiting, on a woman, who had nothing further to give them. She thought about that possibility with a kind of flat, exhausted clarity, stirring the pot on the 7th evening, the fire throwing long shadows across the yard, her own shadow stretched thin and strange across the frozen ground like it belonged to somebody else. Which was when she noticed she wasn't alone. A figure at the edge of the property. Standing so still, at first, that Winnie's stomach dropped straight through the frozen ground, because a stranger appearing silently at dusk on a hard-luck widow's land was not, in her experience, ever good news, not once, not in 2 years of learning exactly what kind of news usually came calling after dark. But then the figure moved, and the movement was old. Stooped. Careful in the particular way of a body that had learned, through long and hard practice, exactly how much it could still ask of itself, before something gave. An old woman. Scarf tied over gray hair. A face like a dried apple, seamed with more winters than Winnie could count in the failing light. Magda Ansel. Winnie knew the name the way everyone in the county knew it, from a distance, wrapped in rumor like a parcel nobody quite trusted to open. The old woman, who lived alone past the ridge. Who spoke, people said, to her garden like it could hear her, and answer back. Who'd come from somewhere, so far east, that nobody local could pronounce the name of it properly, and who was regarded, in the particular calculus of small towns, with a mixture of respect and suspicion that never quite resolved into either one, and never would. Magda stood at the fence for a long moment, taking it all in. The fire. The steaming pot. The pathetic gray congregation of hogs pressed close for warmth, breathing out little clouds that rose and vanished in the cold like small ghosts giving up. She didn't laugh. She didn't pity, either, and that, Winnie realized with something close to relief, was the first time in a week that anyone had looked at her situation, without wearing either expression on their face. "It is hard work," Magda said, "to fill a hungry belly." Her voice carried an accent, thick and unhurried, each word set down like a stone she'd chosen, with care from a riverbed. It wasn't a question. It was simply true, the way a fact is true whether you want it to be or not. "It is," Winnie agreed. Her own voice came out rougher than she meant it to. "They say you are a fool." Magda took a slow step closer, boots crunching frozen ground. "They say you threw good money into a pit that will never fill, no matter how much you pour into it." "They're probably right. Maybe." Magda's head tilted, considering the pot, the fire, the animals, the whole exhausted shape of the woman standing over all of it like a lighthouse keeper too tired to keep the light burning much longer. Maybe not. She came closer still, peered into the steaming pot, with an expression Winnie couldn't quite read. Not judgment. Something closer to appraisal, the way a jeweler looks at a stone, before deciding what it's worth. Cattail. Acorn. A small sound, almost approval, almost not. "Good. Not enough. I know it's not enough. You are feeding them what you can find." Magda straightened, and something in her dark eyes sharpened, focused, the way a teacher's eyes sharpen on a student, who has, at last, asked the right question, without quite realizing she'd asked it. "The hog is a root finder. Do you understand this? It has a nose for what is hidden that no woman, with a shovel will ever match, no matter how hard she digs, no matter how little she sleeps trying." "So what am I supposed to do? Wait for them to find their own supper?" "No." Magda's finger, gnarled and certain, pointed past Winnie's shoulder, toward the far end of the property, a shallow basin, where the ground pitched down, and the soil turned darker, thick with clay, so hard it had defeated every plow that had ever tried it, choked with a few stunted, thorny bushes that grew there, because nothing better could be bothered to. That place. The ground is too hard for a blade. But it holds the damp, deep down, where a blade cannot reach it. Take them there. Let them work. Winnie looked at the basin. It was, without question, the single most useless patch of ground on her entire useless 15 acres, and she'd had 2 years to develop a fine and detailed appreciation for exactly how useless every inch of this land actually was. "There's nothing there," she said. "There is always something." Magda said it, with a flat, unshakable certainty that made the hair rise on the back of Winnie's neck, though she couldn't have said exactly why, standing there in the cold, with a stranger's dry hand somewhere near her elbow. "You have fed their bellies. This is good. This is a kindness. Now you must feed their nature." She reached into the deep pocket of her apron, drew out a fistful of something dried, lumpy, dark, roots of some kind, though of what exactly Winnie couldn't guess in the dying light. "Burdock," Magda said. "Tough. Deep-growing. The hogs will smell it beneath the ground. It will teach their noses where to look, and once they learn that, they will not stop looking." She pressed the roots into Winnie's palm. Her skin was dry, as old paper, and cold, and her grip, for one brief moment, was stronger than Winnie expected, from a woman her age, strong in a way that suggested this hand had done real work, once, and hadn't fully forgotten how. "Do not listen to the town," Magda said. "Listen to the pigs." And then, without waiting for a reply, without so much as a farewell, she turned and walked back toward the tree line, moving with the same slow, careful economy she'd arrived with, until the dusk folded around her, and she was simply gone, the way she'd simply appeared, as if the whole conversation had been conjured by the cold, and the firelight, and Winnie's own exhausted mind. Winnie stood there a long moment, fistful of strange dried roots in one hand, stirring paddle forgotten in the other. The fire popping behind her, throwing sparks up toward a sky gone black, and hard with stars. Because that was the strangest conversation she'd had in a year, maybe longer. And still, something in her chest had shifted. Not hope exactly. Hope felt too large, and too dangerous a word for what she had energy left to carry, that particular night. Something smaller. A possibility. A different shape to look at the same impossible problem from, the way a puzzle looks different once you turn it a quarter turn in your hands. That night, she did the arithmetic again. Same numbers. Same hunger. Same 80 animals, and 2 children, and no well, and less strength every single day than the day before it. But a new variable sat in the column now, small and strange, and entirely unverified. A woman with dried roots in her apron pocket, who spoke about hog noses the way other people spoke about scripture. Certain. Unhurried. Unbothered by what the rest of the county thought she knew, or didn't. Winnie didn't know if it would work. But she had learned, in the last week, standing at that door in the cold, that not knowing wasn't the same as having no reason to try. The next morning, before light, she scattered Magda's dried roots near the low end of the basin, pressing them shallow into the half-frozen ground the way the old woman had shown her, with a few brisk motions of her hand the night before, not buried, just enough to break the surface, enough for a nose to catch a thread of scent riding the cold air. Then, instead of penning the hogs the way she had every single morning, since the auction, she opened the gate, and let them wander. For a long while, nothing happened. The animals milled in the yard, listless, the way they always did, snouts low, hunting old ground they'd already picked clean twice over. Winnie stood at the fence, with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, watching, feeling the first small hot flush of doubt climb up the back of her throat. Because of course nothing would happen. Because why would it? Because she'd let an old stranger's strange certainty talk her into wasting a morning she couldn't spare, standing at a fence, waiting on pigs to do something they'd shown no interest in doing all week. Except one sow lifted her head, snout working the air, with sudden, sharp attention, the way a hunting dog goes still, and pointed the instant it catches a scent worth catching. And then another. And then, one by one, with a kind of gathering purpose that Winnie had not seen in these animals since the day she bought them, the whole ragged herd began to drift toward the low basin, drawn by a thread of scent that existed for them, and not for her, a map written in the air that only their starved and desperate noses could ever hope to read. They began to root. Tentative at first. Snouts pressing, testing, uncertain. Then, within minutes, with a hunger that had finally found something worth aiming itself at, they tore into the hard-packed clay, with a violence that startled her, powerful snouts working like living plowshares, turning soil that had defeated every blade she owned, and half the blades in the county besides. Winnie stood at the fence, and watched 80 starving animals do, in 20 minutes, what she herself had failed to do, with a full week of blistered hands, and a borrowed spade, and more determination than she'd known she still had left in her. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry, and too wary of hope to trust the feeling gathering behind her eyes, as anything but exhaustion playing tricks. But she stood there a long time, watching. Something loosening, very slightly, in her chest for the first time since the auction yard, like a fist she hadn't noticed she was making, finally letting go one finger at a time. The days that followed found a new shape. She still foraged, cattail, bark, whatever the hills would surrender to a determined woman, with 2 buckets, and no other options, but the desperate edge came off the work, because now she was supplementing instead of providing, filling gaps instead of trying, impossibly, to fill an ocean, with a spoon. Her new labor became management instead of pure survival, fencing off sections of the basin she wanted work next, moving the herd, when they'd exhausted a patch, learning to read, in their movements, which corner of the ground still held something worth finding, and which had already given up its secrets. By the end of the second week, a change was visible even, from the road, if anyone had bothered to look, which nobody did, because nobody in Larkspur County was in the habit of looking twice at Winnie Sutter's land. Which turned out, in the end, to be its own kind of gift. Because that was around the time the boy started showing up. He appeared the way stray cats appear. All at once, and also as if he'd been there all along, just outside the edge of your attention, waiting for you to notice. Jasper Cobb. 10 years old, rail-thin, with the watchful stillness of a boy who'd learned early that watching costs less than asking, and asking sometimes costs more than a family like his could afford to spend. He belonged, Winnie knew, to Nathaniel Cobb's family, out on the hardscrabble edge of town, a family that scraped by on less than most, though Nathaniel himself worked steady enough, hiring on wherever work could be found, including, she'd heard in passing, doing odd jobs now, and again for Cornelius Vane's bank. The boy started by simply standing at the property line, elbows on the top fence rail, watching the strange, silent partnership between the widow and her herd, with an attention so total it seemed almost like a form of prayer, or something close enough to it, that Winnie decided not to disturb whatever it was. Winnie remembered too well what it felt like to be watched, and judged by this county. So she didn't chase him off. Just nodded, when she noticed him, and went about her work, and let the nod be enough of a welcome for whatever he needed it to be, until he decided he needed something more. One afternoon, hauling water past the fence line, she finally heard his voice. "That one's the boss." She stopped. Followed the line of his skinny pointing finger to a big sow, with a black patch over one eye, standing apart from the others, with an unmistakable air of command, the way a good foreman stands apart from a work crew, without ever having to say a word about why. "She eats first," Jasper said. "Every time. Watch." Winnie watched. The boy was right. She'd been living alongside this animal for 2 weeks, and somehow never noticed the small, absolute authority the sow carried, the way the others yielded space to her, without seeming to decide to, the way a room goes quiet when a certain kind of person walks into it. "She needs a name, then," Winnie said. Jasper considered this, with the gravity of a man weighing a great decision, brow furrowed, eyes narrowed at the sow like he was reading something written on her hide. "Queenie," he said finally. And so, she was Queenie. The next day he was back, and he named another, a big placid boar, who bore the chaos of feeding time, with such unbothered calm, that Jasper christened him General. A quick, darting little gilt became Dart. By the end of the week there were names for a dozen of them, and by the end of the month there were names for all 80, a running roster the boy kept in his head, with the meticulous care of a man keeping a ledger of something that actually mattered, Patches and Mudpie, and Snuffles and Sirwink, each one earned by some small observed particularity of habit, or face that only a 10-year-old, with nothing but time and attention to spare would ever have bothered noticing. There was something almost unbearably gentle about it. A boy from a hard-luck family, giving careful, dignified names to a herd of animals the whole county still called garbage behind Winnie's back, when they bothered to mention her at all anymore. He never asked for anything in return. Just showed up, after his own chores were done, hauled wood for her fire, patched fence rail, with quiet competence beyond his years, and helped, without being asked, in whatever way the day required of him. The work didn't get lighter. But the loneliness did, and Winnie hadn't realized, until it started to lift, exactly how heavy that particular weight had grown across 2 years of carrying it alone. Jasper's belief in the herd, plain, unironic, entirely without the county's practiced cynicism, did something to shore up her own resolve, that she couldn't have explained if pressed. He didn't see 80 bad investments standing in a muddy pen. He saw 80 individuals, each one worth the trouble of a name, and something in that simple boyish clarity made her own doubts feel, for the first time in weeks, like they might actually be wrong. She noticed it first, as a kind of restlessness. The hogs had, by now, turned over most of the shallow basin, transforming ground that had been hard and dead into something churned, and dark and full of promise. But they kept drifting back to one particular low spot, a place where the clay ran denser, cooler, where even in the thin winter light the soil looked somehow different, somehow heavier with something Winnie couldn't name, and didn't yet have the vocabulary to guess at. They worked that spot, with a focus that unsettled her a little. Not the wandering, opportunistic rooting they did everywhere else across the basin. This was frantic. Directed. As if they'd caught a scent that mattered more than any other scent had ever mattered to them before. She fenced them away from it twice, trying to move them along to fresher ground, the way she'd been carefully managing the rest of the basin all month. Twice they broke through. The third time, she stopped trying. Because there are moments, she was beginning to learn this, slowly, from an old woman's advice, and 80 starving animals who'd turned out to be righter about survival than she had, when the smartest thing a person can do is stop insisting they know better than the instinct standing right in front of them, snout down, working at something the human mind simply can't perceive yet. She let them dig. One still afternoon, the herd went quiet all at once. It was the quiet that stopped her more than any noise could have. 80 animals who spent every waking hour grunting, shoving, rooting, all at once falling into a silence so total that Winnie looked up from the wash she was hanging just to make sure nothing had happened to them, some fear she couldn't name pushing her toward the fence. Nothing had happened. They were simply standing. In a wide, deliberate circle, snouts all pointed the same direction, toward a hole they'd been working for days now, several feet deep, dark at the bottom in a way the surrounding clay wasn't. They stood there, watchful. Still. Waiting, in some manner she couldn't put words to, for something. For her. She set down the wet linens. Walked to the fence. Climbed through, her skirt catching briefly on a splintered rail, freeing it without looking down. The air near the hole felt different. Cooler. Heavier, the way air feels near a spring even, before you've seen the water, though she wouldn't put that name to the feeling, until later, wouldn't let herself hope that far ahead, not yet, not with the ground still capable of disappointing her the same as everything else this winter had. She looked down into the dark clay bottom. Saw nothing but wet earth. But the herd's silence pressed on her like an instruction. Like a command issued in a language she was only just learning to hear, one word at a time, over the course of a month of watching, and waiting and doubting. She went for the shovel. The clay at the bottom of the hole gave way, with a thick, sucking resistance, heavy and cold against the blade. She dug. Heaved the wet earth aside. Dug again. Her arms ached, her breath came in short white clouds in the cold air, and still the herd stood in its silent circle, watching, waiting, certain of something she couldn't yet see with her own eyes. On the fifth shovelful, the resistance changed. She pulled the blade free, and where the clay had been, a small dark stain remained at the bottom of the hole. Spreading, faintly, at its edges, the way a bruise spreads under skin. She stared at it a long moment, not trusting her own eyes. Then she knelt. Pressed 2 fingers into the stain. Cold. Wet. Rising, even as she watched, faster than the thirsty clay around it could swallow it back down. Water. Not rain caught in a barrel. Not the grudging trickle the cistern gave up on its best days, when it bothered to give up anything at all. This was cold, colder than any rain, colder than the sluggish creek 2 miles off, the particular deep cold of water that had been resting somewhere far beneath the surface of the world, untouched by sun, for longer than she wanted to think about standing there, with her hand in it. Her heart began a slow, heavy pounding against her ribs, so loud in her own ears she half expected the herd to hear it too. She widened the hole, with shaking hands, and the seep widened, with it, water pooling now faster than the clay could drink it, gathering at the bottom in a dark, spreading mirror that threw back a thin sliver of gray winter sky. The herd, its work apparently finished, gave a collective sigh. She would have sworn, afterward, that it was a sigh, though she knew perfectly well that animals didn't sigh, not really, not the way people did. And began to drift off toward the shade of the fence line, their part in the miracle concluded, their interest already moving on to the ordinary, unremarkable business of being hogs again. Winnie knelt at the edge of the growing pool, muddy to the elbow, breathing hard, though the digging alone hadn't been hard enough to account for the way her chest was heaving. She dipped her hand into the water, brought it to her lips. Clean, sweet, cold enough to ache in her teeth, and she drank anyway, greedily, like a woman who'd forgotten, until that exact moment, how thirsty she'd been for something more than water. A sound came out of her then, that she didn't recognize as her own voice at first, rough, cracked, and used in that particular register for longer than she could remember using it. It took her a moment, kneeling there in the mud, to understand that she was laughing. Because it had worked. Because a foolish woman's foolish bargain, and an old stranger's stranger advice, and the animal wisdom of 80 half-dead hogs nobody else had wanted at any price, had together unearthed something worth more than everything the town had stood in, that yard and watched her lose. Her first thought, once the laughter passed, and her breathing steadied, was not triumph. It was secrecy. Because this cold sweet water welling up out of ground the whole county had already declared worthless, and moved on from, this was too precious a thing to hand over to people who had stood in that auction yard and laughed at her arithmetic, without a second thought for what it cost her to hear it. She would bank this discovery, like a coal kept low under ash, saving its heat for when she truly needed it, and not one moment before. She had no way of knowing, kneeling there in the churned mud, with muddy hands, and her heart still pounding, that a mile and a half away, in a warm office above the bank, Cornelius Vane had just finished reviewing a survey report for the third time that month, tracing one particular pencil line across a map that included, among its 3 marked parcels, 15 scrubby acres of clay and thistle he'd once dismissed as worthless and hadn't quite managed to stop thinking about since. He didn't know about the water yet. But he would. Because men like Vane did not stay curious forever, without eventually turning that curiosity into action, and the distance between noticing a thing and deciding to take it was, for a man like him, never very far to travel, no matter how much winter stood in between. Which was, though either of them yet fully understood it kneeling in mud, or sitting behind a fine oak desk, the true shape of the conflict now settling over that low, unremarkable stretch of Larkspur County ground. A woman with a secret worth keeping. And a man who had never once, in his whole calculating life, left a secret unclaimed. Spring came late to Larkspur County that year. And when it came grudging. Thin. Like a promise made by a man who already intends to break it the moment it stops being convenient. But on Winnie Sutter's 15 acres, spring came anyway. Because that's what water does. It doesn't care what the sky is doing, or refusing to do. It doesn't care what the county thinks a piece of land deserves, or has earned, or has been sentenced to. It just rises. Finds the roots that are waiting for it, patient in the dark. And makes green out of nothing the way it's done, since long before there were auctioneers standing on crates, selling the very ground it rises, through to the highest bidder or, failing that, to whoever's left standing, when the bidding stops. By the time the first true warmth settled over the valley, the basin behind Winnie's cabin had become something no one who'd stood in that auction yard would have recognized. Squash vines climbing a rough trellis of split branches. Beans threading up hog-turned earth, so dark and loose it looked, in the morning light, almost like a different substance entirely, nothing at all like the hard-pan clay that had defeated every plow in the county. And behind a thick, deliberate screen of gourd vines she and Jasper had trained along the fence line, hidden, on purpose, from the road, the spring itself. Stone-lined now, thanks to weeks of hauling and fitting and her own aching back. Deep. clear as a held breath. She had water. Abundant, limitless water, on land the whole county had sworn was bone dry, and always would be. The arithmetic had changed forever. She wasn't a woman on the edge of ruin anymore. She was becoming, though she barely let herself think the word even alone, at night, with the door bolted, something else. Something she hadn't been in the 2 years since her husband died and left her, with 2 children, and a stack of debts he'd never meant to leave behind. A woman of means. Which should have felt like relief. Instead, most nights, it felt like holding her breath. Nathaniel Cobb had been holding his breath a lot longer than that. He was a big man, built for lifting and hauling, with hands that had done honest work his whole life, and a face that had started, in the last year, to look older than the calendar said he was, the way a man's face gets old fast, when he's carrying something he can't put down, and can't talk about either. He worked wherever work paid. Barn raisings. Fence lines. Threshing come fall. And lately, more and more, for the bank. Which meant, more and more, for Cornelius Vane. He told himself it was just labor. Hauling ledgers from one office to another. Repairing the porch on Vane's fine house in town, the kind of house a man builds, when he wants the whole street to understand something about him, without his having to say it out loud. Riding out now, and then to look at a property Vane was thinking of buying, walking the fence lines, reporting back what he saw, because Vane didn't like to dirty his own boots, when a hired man's boots would do just as well and cost a good deal less. He told himself that for a long time. Right up until the afternoon Vane called him, into the back office, closed the door, and set $2 silver on the desk between them, without saying a single word first, letting the silence and the coins do the talking for him, the way Vane preferred to let most things do his talking. Nathaniel looked at the coins. Didn't touch them. Not yet. That's Sutherland, Vane said. Pleasant. Unhurried. The way he said everything, which was, Nathaniel had learned across a full winter of watching the man work, exactly the tone that meant pay closest attention, because the pleasantness was doing a job, same as everything else about him. Your boy spends a good deal of time up there. He does chores. For the widow. Nothing more to it than that. Good boy. Loyal. Vane's smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes, and hadn't, Nathaniel realized, for as long as he'd known the man. I take it, as a personal favor, Nathaniel, if you'd walk up there yourself now and again. Have a look around. That garden of hers has gotten remarkably green for a piece of ground, with no well on it, and I do find myself curious about things that oughtn't be possible. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Don't see what business that is of the bank's. Everything in this county is the bank's business, sooner or later. Vane pushed the coins an inch closer across the desk, unhurried, the way a man moves a chess piece he's already sure of. I'm not asking you to do her harm. I'm asking you to look. A man can look at a fence line, without it costing anybody a single thing. Nathaniel didn't move for a long moment. Because he needed the money. Because the roof over his own boy's head leaked something fierce in February, and there was no getting around fixing it, before next winter came around again, hard and unforgiving the way winters in this county always were. Because Vane held the paper on half the debts in this county, including, if he was honest, with himself in the particular way a man is only honest, with himself at 2 a.m, a small one of Nathaniel's own, quiet, private, the kind of debt a proud man doesn't mention even to his own wife lying warm beside him in the dark. Which was, he understood even, as he finally reached for the coins, exactly the kind of leverage a man like Vane never once let go to waste, not on principle, not on anything. Just looking, Nathaniel said. Just looking. Vane agreed, and smiled the smile of a man who already knew, with total certainty, that it would turn out to be more than that before the season was out. Jasper didn't know any of this. He only knew that his father had started asking him questions at supper. Small ones? Easy to answer, easy to miss the shape of, if you were 10 years old, and hungry and thinking mostly about the piggy named Dart, and whether Dart's ear infection had finally cleared up the way Winnie said it would. "That garden doing well up there?" "It's doing real good, Pa. Winnie says the squash is coming in early this year." "She say where the water comes from? For all that green?" "Rain, I guess." A shrug. A boy's shrug, unbothered, already thinking about something else entirely, some other corner of the day worth more of his attention than his father's supper-table curiosity. "And the cistern?" Nathaniel had nodded. Said nothing more. And felt something in his chest twist tighter every single time his own son handed him another small piece of the answer Vane was paying for, one supper at a time, without Jasper ever understanding what the questions were actually for. Because that was the shape of it now. His son's innocent chatter, funneled, without Jasper ever once knowing, into Cornelius Vane's careful ledger of things worth eventually taking. Nathaniel told himself he'd stop it there. Wouldn't press further at the table. Wouldn't ride up to the Sutter place himself, and look with his own 2 eyes at whatever it was Vane wanted looked at so badly. He told himself that. Believed it, even, for the better part of 3 days. And then, 3 days later, he rode up anyway. Because the $2 silver had become $5. And $5, in a house, with a leaking roof, and a wife, who never once complained, though he could see the worry sitting behind her eyes every time she looked up at the water-stained ceiling, was not a thing a man could simply refuse on principle alone. Principle didn't keep rain off a mattress. Principle didn't fix a roof. Only money did that, and Vane was the only man in the county offering him any that spring. He came at dusk, on foot, leaving his horse tied at the road the way a man does, when he wants to arrive quiet, when he doesn't especially want anyone to hear him coming. He told himself it was innocent. A neighborly visit, nothing more, to see how the widow's garden was coming along, the same as any man in the county might do on a fine evening, with nothing better to occupy him. He didn't get past the fence line before he saw it. The green. God, the green of it. Squash leaves broad, as dinner plates, bean vines thick, and dark, and behind that screen of gourds he wasn't quite tall enough to see clean over, the unmistakable glint of standing water catching the last of the light, throwing it back up at the darkening sky like something that had no business existing on ground everybody in the county still called Sutter's Waste. His stomach dropped straight through the ground beneath his boots. Because he understood, standing there in the fading dusk, with his hat in his hands, exactly what he was looking at. Not a lucky cistern. Not a wet spring, that would dry up again by August the way they always did. A spring. A real one. The kind of find that changed a man's whole future, or a woman's, in the space of one shovelful of clay turned over at exactly the right moment. And he understood, in the very same breath, exactly what Cornelius Vane would do with that information the moment it reached his desk. He stood at the fence a long moment. Didn't go closer. Didn't need to. Because he'd already seen enough to ruin his own sleep for a month. He didn't sleep that night. Lay beside his wife in the dark, staring at a ceiling he couldn't see, doing arithmetic of his own, different numbers than Winnie's, but no less brutal for being different. $5 already spent on the roof. A boy who loved that widow's animals like they were his own family. A debt to Vane that would come due, one way or another, whether Nathaniel played along with the man's quiet requests, or not, because men like Vane didn't forget a debt just because a man stopped answering his questions. And against all of it, sitting heavy in his chest, the memory of Winnie Sutter's face at that auction. The laughter that had followed her all the way home up that frozen track. The particular loneliness of a woman the whole county had already decided, collectively, without ever voting on it out loud, not to help. He realized somewhere near 2 a.m, staring at nothing, exactly the kind of man Vane had built his whole business on. Not a villain, not in his own accounting of himself. Just a man, with debts and a family, and not enough room left over, after all that, to be brave. He hated the shape of that realization more than he'd hated anything in a long, long time. The next morning, He told Vane the garden was doing well, because of the cistern. A wet spring, nothing more. A lucky season, that was all. He watched Vane's face while he said it. Watched the small, patient smile that told him, with total and immediate clarity, that Vane didn't believe a single word of it. The cistern, Vane repeated. Slow. Turning the lie over in his mouth like a coin he was checking for a maker's mark, before deciding whether to spend it. That's all I saw. Vane didn't argue. Didn't need to. He simply reached into the desk drawer, drew out 3 more silver dollars, and set them beside the first 5, which Nathaniel hadn't yet had the stomach to spend on anything, roof or otherwise. Keep looking, Nathaniel, Vane said. Pleasant as ever, pleasant in that way that had started to feel, to Nathaniel, like a hand closing slowly around his throat. I do so hate an unfinished ledger. Up on the ridge, in a cottage that smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, Magda Ansell had her own reasons for watching Winnie Sutter's land, reasons that had nothing at all to do with silver dollars, and everything to do with a debt of a different kind, one that had been sitting unpaid in her chest for the better part of 30 years. She hadn't told Winnie the whole truth that first night at the fence line. Hadn't told her, because there hadn't yet been a reason to, and because some truths are too heavy to hand a stranger, before you know for certain whether her back is strong enough to carry them without buckling. But she'd carried a truth long enough now. It was time. She came up the track on a warm afternoon in early summer, found Winnie kneeling in the garden, with dirt to her elbows, Mabel toddling between the bean rows chasing something only a 4-year-old could see, and Jasper up on the fence rail counting hogs out loud for the sheer satisfaction of hearing the number climb. It is good, Magda said, by way of greeting, taking in the green, the water glinting behind its screen of vines. Better than good. Winnie sat back on her heels, wiping a forearm across her brow, leaving a smear of dirt in its wake. We wouldn't have any of it without you. No. Magda's voice had gone strange. Quieter. You would not. Something in her tone made Winnie set down her trowel. I did not come here by chance, that first night, Magda said. I want you to understand this clearly. I did not simply happen to be walking past the starving woman's fence at dusk, the way you have perhaps let yourself believe. Winnie waited. Because some silences asked to be filled by the person who broke them, not the person who's listening, and she had learned, across 2 hard years, exactly which kind of silence was which. I lived on this land, Magda said. Long before you. Long before the auctioneer's father, even, though it was his hand, Cornelius's father, that took it from me in the end. The name landed in the warm afternoon air like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading out slow. Took it, Winnie repeated. Careful. How? Paper. Magda's mouth twisted around the word like it tasted bad even now, even after 30 years of practice saying it. A claim. A signature I did not make on a document I did not understand, because my English then was not what it is now, and the man who explained it to me was not explaining. He was arranging the whole time, and I was too young, and too grieving, and too far from home to see the difference. And the elder Vane bought the claim from the man who forged my signature. For very little money. Very little, for 15 acres, and a spring he already knew was there, because his own son had surveyed it for him first, the same as the son surveys everything now, the same way, the exact same way, 30 years later. Winnie felt something cold settle low in her stomach, heavier than the summer heat should have allowed. Because that meant the spring wasn't luck. It meant Vane's family had known, had always known, exactly what sat beneath this ground, generations of them, quietly patient. And they'd taken it once already, from an old woman, with imperfect English, and no one standing beside her to fight, the same way, near enough, that they'd very nearly taken everything, from a widow, with no family, within 400 miles to call on for help. Why didn't you tell me this from the start? Winnie asked. Not angry. Just tired. Tired in the particular way you get when you realize a fight has been going on far longer than you knew you were even part of it. Because I did not know, that first night, whether you would find the water at all. Magda's dark eyes were steady, unapologetic. And because some stories are too heavy to hand a stranger, before you have watched her carry something else first. I needed to see, before anything else, what kind of woman you were underneath the exhaustion. And now? Now I have seen. Magda reached out, gripped Winnie's dirt-caked hand in both of hers, dry and cool, and stronger than they looked, stronger than an old woman's hands had any right to be. Now I tell you everything. Because Cornelius will come for this water the same way his father came for it. It is in his blood, this taking, passed down the same, as a name, or a nose, or a bad temper. And you will need to know the whole shape of the enemy, not just the part of him that smiles at you across a fence. It was Jasper who found the foundation. 2 days after Magda's visit, working the far edge of the basin, with the hoe Winnie had given him, clearing ground for a second planting she decided the season could support, his blade struck something that wasn't clay. Stone. Not a loose rock, the kind that studded every acre of this county like buckshot. Set stone. Squared. Laid in a line that ran, when he cleared the dirt away, with his hands careful, curious, straight and deliberate for 6 feet, before curving at a corner too clean to be an accident of nature. Winnie! His voice cracked, with the effort of not shouting it across the whole valley. Winnie, come look! Come look right now! She came at a run, Mabel on her hip, and knelt beside him in the churned earth, brushing dirt from stone, with her free hand, while Jasper worked the other side, with the focused seriousness of a boy, who understood, without being told, that he'd found something important. A foundation. Old. Half sunk into ground, that had swallowed it slowly, over decades, the way ground swallows everything given enough patient time, and enough seasons of rain, and root and frost. But unmistakable. A house had stood here once. Small by the size of the footprint. A single room, maybe 2, no more than that. There was a cabin here, Winnie said, half to herself, tracing the line of stone, with 2 fingers. Before mine. Before the auction ever happened, before any of this. She thought of Magda's face 2 days before. The particular weight in her voice, when she'd said this land, the way the words had come out heavier than the rest of her sentence. She sent Jasper for the old woman, that same afternoon, and Magda came slower than usual, leaning harder on her stick than Winnie had ever seen her lean, and when she reached the basin, and looked down at the exposed line of stone, something moved across her weathered face, that Winnie had no name for. Not quite grief. Not quite relief. Something that lived in the narrow country between the two, where most true feelings actually reside. My hearth, Magda said. Quiet. That corner there. My mother's hearth, where she cooked every meal I remember eating, as a child. She lowered herself down, onto a fallen log, slow, careful, and sat looking at the stone for a long, while without speaking at all, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes somewhere far past the stone itself. I was young, she said finally. Younger than you are now. My husband dead 2 winters, same as yours is dead 2 winters. I worked this ground alone, the way you have worked it alone. I found no spring, the old vein never let me search long enough to find one, because he moved fast, once he decided a thing was going to be his. What happened to you? After they took it. After, I went to the ridge. Built again, smaller, further from the road, where a man like that does not think to look twice, does not bother remembering a widow, who caused him no further trouble. A dry, humorless sound that might once, decades ago, have been a laugh. I told myself I had made peace with it. 30 years I told myself this same story, until I very nearly believed it myself. She looked up. Met Winnie's eyes directly, without flinching. I did not believe it, she said. Not truly. Not until this very moment, sitting on this log, looking at my mother's hearthstone sitting in another woman's garden, 30 years and 1 whole life later. Winnie sat down beside her on the log. Didn't say anything for a while. some grief doesn't want company right away. It wants witness. There's a difference, and Winnie had learned it the hard way herself, 2 years back, in a cold house, with a dead husband, and no one but silence to keep her company, through the worst of the nights. I have papers, Magda said finally into that long silence. Old ones? My husband's claim, filed proper, before the forgery ever happened. I kept them 30 years in a tin box under my floorboards, because some part of me, the part that never quite believed my own careful peace, knew that someday they might matter again to somebody. Winnie felt something shift inside her. Not quite hope. Something with sharper edges than hope. Something closer to purpose, which was, she was beginning to understand, a sturdier thing to build on anyway. Would they hold up? She asked. In a courtroom. Against Vane's whole family name. I do not know. Magda's voice was honest, unflinching, the way her voice always was, with Winnie, even when the honesty cost something. The son is not the father. The law does not always care whose hand did the wrong, only whose name sits clean on the paper now, today, in front of the judge. But it's a start. It is a start, Magda agreed. And something in her tired old face, for just a moment, looked almost young again, lit from somewhere underneath 30 years of careful, practiced grief. Which is more than I have had to work with in 30 years. The rains that should have come in June did not come. By the first week of July, the creek that fed the town had shrunk from a lively stream to a string of stagnant pools, brown and shrinking a little more each day beneath a sky gone hard and white with heat, the kind of sky that made a man's eyes ache just from looking at it too long. The prairie grass, that should have stood green and thick, had cured early to the color of old straw, and dust rose off the fields in slow hazy columns that never quite settled, hanging in the air like the county itself was exhaling something it couldn't manage to hold in any longer. Larkspur County had seen dry years before. Everyone had a story about the last bad one, told with the particular grim relish of men comparing old wounds across a fence rail. But this had the shape of something worse. Something that made farmers stand at their fence lines at dusk, staring at a sky that refused to give them anything at all, faces gone tight and gray with a fear too old and too familiar to bother naming out loud, because naming it never once made it smaller. Wells started to fail. First the shallow ones in town, then, one by one, through July, the deeper farm wells too, until the sound of a pump handle working dry, that hollow, useless clatter, had become the sound every family in the county dreaded hearing rise up from their own yard first thing in the morning. Cattle went thin fast. Men who'd fed their herds on pride all spring started selling off stock for pennies on the dollar to drovers passing through, because a half-price sale beat a dead animal every single time, and every rancher in the valley knew it even, as it broke something small and permanent in them to admit it out loud to a stranger, with a wagon. And through all of it, up on 15 acres, that everyone still, out of old habit more than anything else, called worthless, Winnie Sutter's garden stayed green. Impossibly, defiantly green. Squash vines thick and glossy. Beans climbing high and heavy with pods. 80 hogs, sleek now, fattened, nothing at all like the walking skeletons that had shuffled up that road in the dead of winter, wallowing in cool mud behind a screen of vines that couldn't quite hide, anymore, exactly how much water was flowing on the other side of it. From the county road, travelers began to slow their wagons, staring up at that impossible ridge of green cresting a hillside that should, by every rule the Drought had written that summer, have been every bit as dead as everything around it. The whispers started small. Then they didn't stay small for very long at all. Colonel Augustus Reeve heard the whispers, before he saw the green himself, which was, given the man's usual habits, an unusual order for things to happen in. Reeve had built a name in this county the old-fashioned way, hard land, hard years, and a reputation for plain dealing that had survived 4 decades, without a single serious dent, which in Larkspur County was itself something close to a genuine miracle. He'd fought in the war, come home to nothing but a burn-out barn and a stubborn streak wider than the county road, and turned that stubborn streak into the largest, best-run cattle operation for 30 miles in any direction a man cared to ride. When Reeves spoke at a council meeting, men listened, not because he demanded it, not because his voice was loud, but because in 54 years he'd rarely spoken, without good cause, and the county had learned to trust the ratio. He'd heard the widow Sutter's name plenty, over the winter. Heard it the way most of the county had, as a cautionary tale, a small sad joke about a woman who'd thrown good money, after bad hogs at a January auction nobody, with any sense would have bid at. He hadn't thought much more about it than that. A man running 1,100 head of cattle, through a drought didn't have a great deal of spare thought to hand out to other people's misfortunes. But by late July, with his own creek pools shrinking daily, and his hands starting to murmur about moving the herd north, before it was too late to matter, Reeve found himself, one hot evening, riding the county road on some other errand entirely, and slowing his horse, without quite meaning to, at the sight of that green hillside rising up out of a valley gone the color of old bone. He sat there a long moment, just looking. Because a man who'd spent 40 years reading land the way other men read newspapers didn't need to ride up and knock on a cabin door to understand what he was seeing. Green like that, in a drought like this, on ground everyone swore was dry as a bone, that wasn't luck. Luck didn't hold an entire season together. That was water. Real water. The kind that changed the entire calculation of who survived this summer standing up and who didn't. He turned his horse toward town instead of home. Because a discovery like that deserved more thought than he could give it alone on a dusty road at dusk, and Reeve had learned, across 54 hard years, exactly which kind of thoughts were worth sitting with Ray, while before he acted on them. Cornelius Vane heard about the hillside the same week, though from a rather more motivated source than idle county gossip. He rode out himself on a Tuesday afternoon, his fine horse picking a careful path up the rutted track, his coat too well cut for the heat, his smile already arranged, before he'd so much as opened the gate, the way a man arranges his face, before walking into a room he intends to control. He found Winnie in the garden, weeding unhurried, the very picture of rustic industry, though her eyes came up sharp and wary the moment his horse's shadow fell across the row she was working. "Good day, widow," he said, warm as poured syrup. "It seems your investment has paid off rather handsomely. The whole town is quite amazed, I'm told, though I understand you've kept the particulars rather close to your chest. The land turned out better than people thought." She didn't stop working. Didn't give him the satisfaction of standing to greet him properly. "That's all there is to it, Mr. Vane." "Indeed." His eyes moved past her, slow and deliberate, cataloging everything worth cataloging. The thick screen of vines along the fence. The suspicious health of the hogs dozing in the shade beyond it. The low, contented grunting audible even from where he sat his horse. "Remarkably better. My congratulations. A woman alone, accomplishing so much. Quite an inspiration to us all, truly." The compliment landed the way he intended it to. Which is to say, not as a compliment at all. Winnie straightened slowly. Met his eyes without flinching, though her heart had picked up a hard, quick rhythm beneath her ribs, that she was careful not to let show anywhere on her face. "Was there something you needed, Mr. Vane?" "Only to offer my congratulations." A pause, timed for effect, the way everything about the man was timed for effect, down to the last breath. "And to mention that if you ever considered selling, you know precisely where to find me. A property with such surprising fertility might fetch a very fair price. Enough, I'd imagine, to see you and those 2 children of yours settled somewhere considerably more comfortable than a 15-acre stretch of clay and thistle. I'm not selling." "Of course not." He smiled, unbothered, and something in the ease of that unbothered smile frightened her more than open anger ever could have. "The offer stands. These are hard times, widow. Circumstances change quickly in a drought. It would be a terrible shame to face them alone, without a friend at the bank standing ready to help." He tipped his hat, turned his horse, rode away unhurried down the same rutted track he'd come up, and Winnie stood watching him go, with her heart still hammering, because she understood, clearly, coldly, exactly what had just happened at her own fence line. She had not just fielded a social call. She had been prospected. Same as a man prospects a vein of silver, before he decides whether it's worth the trouble and expense of sinking a mine. That night, after the children were down, she sat at the small table, with Magda's old tin box open in front of her, brought down from the ridge 2 days before, the papers inside brittle, and yellowed but legible still, a dead husband's claim filed proper 30 years back, and beneath it, in a careful hand, a description of a forged signature that had stolen it all away in a single afternoon. She read them twice. Then a third time, more slowly. Because she understood, sitting there in the low lamplight, with Vane's visit still crawling under her skin like something that hadn't finished happening yet, that the ground beneath her feet held 2 secrets now instead of 1. A spring that could save a drought-struck county from the worst summer in living memory. And a crime, 30 years old, that had put that spring in her hands in the first place, by way of an old woman's stolen home, and a young widow's foolish, desperate bid at a January auction. 2 threads. Pulling, slowly, inevitably, toward the same knot. And somewhere in town, she knew without needing to be told, Cornelius Vane was doing arithmetic of his own, counting wells gone dry, counting desperate neighbors, counting exactly how much a county in genuine crisis might be willing to hand over to any man who promised, loud enough and confident enough, that he alone could save them all. She closed the tin box. Sat a long moment in the quiet, listening to her children breathe behind the thin curtain, to the low contented sounds of 80 hogs settling for the night in a yard that had once held nothing but dying animals, and a woman's desperate, foolish hope, and now held something else entirely. The coal was still banked, still low under its careful ash. But she understood now, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest, that the wind was picking up across the whole valley. And banked coals, however carefully kept, do not stay hidden forever once a wind like that starts to blow in earnest. The drover came up the county road on a Tuesday, and Larkspur County would talk about that Tuesday for years afterward, the way small towns talk about the single day everything finally tipped. His name was Amos Whitlock. A hard man, sun-cooked the color of old saddle leather, with a herd of longhorns behind him, so gaunt their hip bones threw shadows in the noon light like something out of a bad dream. He'd pushed them 50 dry miles already. Was prepared to push them 50 more, because that's what a man did, when the alternative was standing there watching 200 head die, where they stood in the road, one after another, with nothing he could do about any of it. He'd heard it in town first. A rumor, tossed off sideways by a storekeeper too tired and too dry-mouthed to care how it sounded to a stranger. "Try the widow past the ridge," the man had said, barely looking up. "They say she's got water. And pigs fat enough to make a preacher weep with envy." Whitlock hadn't believed it. Not really. Not after 50 miles of dust, and dead grass, and wells gone to nothing, but dry throats sunk into the ground. Except he rode up anyway. Because a man that desperate simply doesn't have the luxury of disbelief, not when disbelief might cost him the whole herd. And what he found, cresting that last rise, stopped him cold in the saddle. Green. Not the sickly, drought-stunted green of a plant fighting a losing battle for its life. Real green. Deep and glossy, and thick, squash leaves the size of dinner plates, bean vines climbing higher than a man's head sitting a horse. And beyond a screen of trained gourd vines, 80 hogs, 80, he counted them twice, because his own mind refused the number the first time through, sleek and fat, and glistening with health, wallowing in mud, that had no business existing anywhere, within 100 miles of where he currently sat. He swung down off his horse slow. Had already coming off his head, before he'd fully decided to take it off. "Ma'am." His voice cracked on the word, rough with 50 miles of dust. "They told me you had water. Didn't tell me you were a miracle worker." Winnie looked at him a long moment. At his exhausted face. At the herd behind him, ribs showing plain, eyes gone glassy, with a thirst that went bone deep. She didn't see a threat standing at her gate. She saw a man who understood, the way she understood, exactly what it cost to watch something you loved starve for want of a thing the ground refused, for reasons of its own, to give. My hogs found a spring, she said. Simple. No embellishment, no story attached to it. I have water. Whitlock's whole body seemed to sag, with relief, right there in the yard, the way a fence post sags, when the ground beneath it finally, after years of holding, gives way all at once. Can I buy some? Ma'am, I'll pay anything you ask. Just enough to get this herd to the next river, before I lose the whole outfit. She looked at his cattle. Looked at her own fat, healthy animals rooting contentedly behind her, unbothered by any of it. And felt the arithmetic shift inside her, one more time, into a shape it hadn't held before, not once, not through the entire brutal winter. Because this wasn't about her own survival anymore. Hadn't been, not really, since the day the spring came up cold and sweet under Jasper's shovel back in January. This was about what she owed. To a world that had, for one long hard winter, owed her nothing at all, and given her considerably less. There's a fair price for labor, she said. And there's a price for desperation. I'd only charge the first one. 10 cents a barrel. You draw it yourself. Whitlock stared at her. 10 cents. He could have been asked for $1. $5. He'd have paid it gladly, and thanked her twice for the privilege of paying it. Her generosity struck him silent for a full 3 seconds, which for a man who'd been shouting himself hoarse at cattle for 50 dry miles was its own small miracle. His men spent the rest of the day hauling barrel after barrel from the stone-lined pool, letting the herd drink its fill at last, and by dusk, when Whitlock came to the porch to settle his account, he looked at her hogs one more time, with an expression she'd come to recognize by now. Appraisal. Genuine, unhidden appraisal, the kind that had nothing whatsoever to do with pity. Finest pigs I've seen in 10 years, he said. I'm bound for the mining camps up north. They pay top dollar for good pork up there, real top dollar. I'll give you 20 a head. Cash money right now, no waiting on it. Winnie did the sum in her head. $200 for 10 head. More money than she'd ever held in one place in her entire life. More than she'd earned in 2 full years bent over other people's washing. It was vindication. It was security. It was proof, in the only language men like Cornelius Vane had ever bothered to understand, that what she'd built here on 15 worthless acres was not foolishness. Had never been foolishness, not for one single day of it. I'll sell you 10, she said. I keep the rest for breeding stock. 80's a herd worth protecting now. The deal was struck under a sky gone orange with sunset. Whitlock counted coin into her palm, $200 in careful stacks. His men cut 10 fat hogs from the herd, and by the time his outfit pulled out at first light the next morning, the news of it had already started traveling faster than any wagon on that road could ever hope to carry it. A drover had paid cash money for the widow Sutter's pigs. Had watered 200 head of thirsty cattle. From a spring on land the whole county had sworn, for a full year, was dry as bones straight through. The secret was out. Cornelius Vane heard it before breakfast. He sat very still at his own table for a long moment, after the news reached him, coffee cooling untouched in front of him, and felt something in his chest go tight, and cold and absolutely certain, the way a man feels, when a plan he's nursed for years suddenly starts moving faster than he ever intended it to. Because he'd been patient. Because he'd waited 2 years for those 3 parcels to fall into his hand, one piece at a time, the way a careful man waits for a hand of cards to complete itself, without ever showing his own hand too early. And now the whole county knew what only he was supposed to know, what he'd spent 2 years quietly making sure only he knew. He set his cup down. Stood. Straightened his coat, with 2 sharp tugs, the way he always did, before walking into a room he intended to own completely. He had, he told himself, walking out into the morning heat, exactly one advantage left to him now. Speed. By that afternoon he'd called an emergency session of the town council, and by evening every man, who mattered in Larkspur County was crowded, into the meeting hall above the Mercantile, sweating in the July heat, fanning themselves with their own hats, while Vane stood at the front, and did what he did better than any man in the whole valley. He made desperation sound like duty. "Gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried the particular gravity of a man about to say something he'd rehearsed for hours in front of a looking-glass. "We stand at a crisis point. Wells failing across the county, one after another. Cattle dying in the field where they stand. And meanwhile, one parcel of land sits on what may be the only significant water source for 30 miles in any direction, controlled entirely by a single private party, unaccountable to anyone but herself." Murmurs. Uneasy. The particular sound of frightened men looking for someone, anyone, to blame that wasn't the merciless sky itself. "I propose," Dane continued, "that under emergency powers, this council authorize public stewardship of any water source found necessary for the survival of this community. Effective immediately, tonight before another family's well runs dry." He didn't say Winnie's name. Didn't need to. Every man in that room understood exactly which private party he meant, and Vane understood that too, and had planned his whole speech around never once having to say it out loud. Colonel Reeve, seated near the back, with his arms folded, and his hat still on, which he never did indoors, not once in 54 years, watched Vane work the room, with the particular attention of a man reading terrain, before a battle he already suspected was coming. He said nothing yet. Just watched. Waited. Filed away the shape of the thing being built in front of him, the way he'd learned, 40 years back in a war he still carried pieces of, to read the shape of an ambush, before it fully sprang. The council voted that night. 3 in favor. 2 abstaining, uneasy, unwilling to fully sign their names to what felt, even to men, who wanted badly to believe otherwise, like something closer to a taking than any honest stewardship. But 3 was enough to carry it. Nathaniel Cobb heard about the vote the next morning, standing in his own kitchen, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and felt something inside him crack straight down the middle, clean through, the way dry wood cracks under too much weight all at once. Because he'd told himself, all these weeks, that he was just looking. Just reporting what any curious neighbor might see, over a fence line on an ordinary evening. He understood now, standing there with the news settling cold in his stomach, exactly what his looking had been used to build, brick by careful brick. An excuse. A legal-sounding reason for Cornelius Vane to walk onto Winnie Sutter's land, and take, by vote of 3 frightened men in a hot meeting hall, what he'd never once managed to buy, from her directly. Jasper came into the kitchen behind him, still half asleep, hair sticking up every direction imaginable. "Pa, you look sick." Nathaniel looked at his son a long moment. At the boy who'd spent his whole summer naming pigs, with more tenderness than most grown men managed for their own children, let alone somebody else's. At the boy, who trusted Winnie Sutter the way only a 10-year-old could trust someone who'd never once given him a single reason not to. "Jasper," he said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to, rougher than he'd intended any word to sound in front of his own son. "I need you to go on ahead to the Sutter place, without me this morning. Tell her." He stopped. Started again, forcing the words out. "Tell her I need to speak with her. Today. It's important, and it can't wait on chores." He rode up alone, that afternoon, and Winnie met him at the fence the way she met everyone lately, with a wariness that had become a kind of armor she didn't take off even for friends, even for men she'd known most of a year now. Except Nathaniel Cobb had never quite qualified, as a friend, not fully. He'd always stood a little apart, polite, distant, and she never fully understood exactly why until she saw his face, that afternoon and recognized, immediately, without needing a single word of explanation, the particular look of a man about to confess something that had been eating him alive, from the inside out for months. "Mrs. Sutter." He didn't get down off his horse right away. Sat there a moment, hat in his hands, working up to it the way a man works up to jumping into cold water. "I owe you the truth. And I expect once you hear it, you won't want it delivered from horseback like some kind of coward, so. He got down, stood in front of her, hat still in his hands, and made himself meet her eyes directly, though it plainly cost him something to do it. Vane's been paying me, he said, since spring, to watch your land. Report back what I saw. The words landed like a slap across the face. Winnie felt her whole body go rigid, every muscle at once. My son, Nathaniel pressed on, because stopping now would have been its own kind of cowardice, worse than the confession itself. Never knew a single thing about it. Whatever he told me at supper, about your garden, about the water, he told me the way any boy tells his father about his day, nothing more than that. He never once knew I was carrying it straight to Vane's office. How much? Winnie's voice came out flat. Dangerous. How much did my whole life cost you, Nathaniel? He flinched at that. Deserved to, and knew it. $8 all told. He said it plain, without flinching further, because a confession only half made isn't worth the trouble of making at all. For a leaking roof. That's the whole shameful arithmetic of it, start to finish. Silence stretched between them, long enough that Winnie heard, distantly, Jasper's voice calling out to one of the hogs somewhere behind the cabin, cheerful, entirely oblivious, and the sound of it made the whole betrayal land even harder than it already had, because that boy's affection for her had been real the entire time, even while his father's reports were being sold off by the pound. Why tell me now? She asked finally. Why not just keep quiet, and let Vane do whatever it is he's already planning to do? Because I stood at your fence line 3 weeks ago, and looked at that spring and understood exactly what it was going to cost you, all of it, right down to the last barrel. Nathaniel's jaw was tight, his eyes wet in a way he plainly hated showing anybody. And I've been telling myself every night since that a man's got to feed his family, has to, no way around it. And every single morning since that a man, who sells out a widow to a bank, so his own roof stays dry isn't much of a man to begin with, roof or no roof. So which is it? It's the second one. He said it hard. Final. Like a door closing on an argument he'd been quietly losing to himself for weeks running. The council's voting to seize your water tomorrow at the emergency session, formal and legal on paper. Vane's building the whole case on exactly what I told him, word for word. I can't undo what I already gave him, no way to take it back now. But I can stand up in front of the whole county tomorrow, and tell every last one of them how he got it. Winnie looked at him a long time, saying nothing. Because trust, once broken, doesn't mend just because the man breaking it feels bad about it afterward. She understood that. Had learned it, in smaller ways, across 2 full years of a county watching her fail, and doing exactly nothing to stop it. But she also understood something else, standing there in the heat, with her fists clenched at her sides. That a man brave enough to ride up, and confess a shameful thing to your face, before it could do him any further good to keep it hidden, was worth something different, something better than a man, who never once found the courage to be ashamed at all. Tomorrow, she said, you stand up. In front of everyone in that hall. I will. You have my word on it, for whatever that's worth to you now. And Jasper stays away, from whatever's left of your work for Vane. There's nothing left of it, Nathaniel said. I rode straight, from Vane's office to tell him so, before I ever once rode up here to tell you the truth of it. That night, Winnie sat at the small table, with Magda's tin box open in front of her one more time, and this time she wasn't alone with it. Magda sat across from her, the old papers spread between them in the lamplight. And beside them both, having ridden up unannounced an hour before with his hat still on, and his face set in the particular grim expression of a man who'd spent the entire day chasing down old county records, sat Colonel Augustus Reeve. I went to the courthouse this morning, Reeve said. His voice carried the flat, unhurried authority of a man used to being believed the first time he opened his mouth. After I saw your hillside, from the road last week, I couldn't let it alone. Something about the shape of it bothered me the whole ride home, and it kept bothering me clean through breakfast. What did you find? Winnie asked. More than I expected to, and worse. Reeve laid a small stack of copied documents on the table, his hands, big and scarred, careful with the paper the way a man's hands get careful when he's handling something he understands is genuinely dangerous. Your friend's claim isn't the only one, Mrs. Ansell. There's a pattern going back 30 years, plain as day once a man knows to look for it. For other parcels, all adjoining water, or good bottomland, all transferred out of the original claimant's hands, within a year or two of a Vane's survey. 2 of those claimants were widows, same as this one. One was a man who lost an arm at Shiloh, and couldn't hold a pen steady enough to argue his own signature had been forged out from under him. Magda's face had gone very still, listening to every word. I knew him, she said quietly. The one-armed man. Corbett, his name was. He died believing it was his own fault, right up to his last breath. That he'd signed something he shouldn't have, because his hand shook too badly to properly read what he was putting his name to that day. It wasn't his fault, Reeve said. Flat. Certain. It was a pattern. And patterns don't happen by accident, not 4 separate times across 30 years, not all of them pointing back to the exact same family name on the exact same kind of paper. He looked at Winnie across the table, his eyes steady. I fought beside men who came home from that war to find this very thing done to them, he said, and something in his voice had gone rougher, older, carrying weight that went back decades to places he rarely spoke of at all. I buried 2 of them myself, men who never got their land back, and never once stopped believing, right up until the end, that they'd somehow failed to deserve it in the first place. I will not stand by and watch it happen a 5th time. Not while I've still got breath enough left in me to stand up in a meeting hall and say so out loud. The council chamber was full past its walls the next evening. Word had traveled the way word travels in a small county, fast, and swollen with rumor by the time it reached the very last farm on the very last road. Vane stood at the front, composed, certain, a man who'd rehearsed his victory the same careful way he rehearsed everything else in his life. Behind him, the 3 council members who'd voted with him sat in a row, trying hard to look like men executing a solemn public duty instead of men who'd been carefully maneuvered into a corner they hadn't fully understood they were walking into. The council has declared a state of emergency, Vane began, once the room had settled enough for his voice to carry clean over it. By ordinance, all private water sources critical to public survival are to be placed under public stewardship. We are here tonight to formalize that stewardship for the good of this entire community, every family in it. For the good of the community, Winnie repeated, standing near the front, her voice steady, though her heart hammered hard enough that she could feel it in her own throat. Or for the good of the bank that holds paper on half the men sitting in this room tonight. A ripple through the crowd. Uneasy laughter, quickly swallowed back down. Vane's smile didn't move an inch. I understand this is difficult for you, Mrs. Sutter. But a single person cannot be permitted to hoard a resource this vital, while an entire county suffers around her. I haven't hoarded a single drop of anything. She turned slow, deliberate, addressing the whole room instead of him alone. Yesterday I sold 10 hogs and 200 barrels of water to a drover passing through with a dying herd behind him. I charged him 10 cents a barrel, when I could have charged him a full $1, and he'd have paid it gladly, no argument. Ask anyone in this room whether that sounds like hoarding to them. Vane's jaw tightened, just slightly. Just enough for the men closest to the front to notice it happen. A generous exception, he said, which changes nothing whatsoever about the necessity of proper public oversight going. How did you know the count? The question came from Winnie, flat and clear, cutting straight through the middle of his sentence like a blade through cloth. Vane blinked. I beg your pardon. The count of my herd. Yesterday you told this entire council I'd sold 10 head, out of 80, and that I still had 70 remaining being your exact word, in the notice posted outside this hall this very morning. She let that sit a moment, watching it land on every face in the room. I never told a single soul that number. Whitlock's men didn't know it. My own son couldn't have told you, because I never once counted that heard out loud in front of anybody, but Jasper Cobb and myself. The room had gone very quiet. So I'll ask you again. Winnie said. How did you know? A long beat. Long enough that Vane's silence became, all on its own, a kind of answer the whole room could plainly read. Nathaniel Cobb stood up from the back row. He knew, Nathaniel said, because I told him. Because he's been paying me, since spring, to watch her land, and report back what I saw, with my own eyes. I counted that herd myself, Tuesday last, from the fence line, and carried the number straight to his office, same as I'd been doing every week, or so all summer long. Gasps. A low, rolling murmur that swept the room front to back like wind through wheat. That's a serious accusation, Nathaniel, Vane said, and for the first time, that entire evening his voice had lost a fraction of its careful polish, just a hairline crack, but a crack all the same. It's a serious truth, Nathaniel said back, not backing down an inch. I've got $8 of your money I never spent, sitting in a jar at home right now, because I couldn't stomach touching it once I understood what it had actually cost. I'll hand it back to you right here in front of God, and this whole county, if it means every man in this room finally understands exactly what kind of stewardship you're really offering them. Vane's composure cracked further, just at the edges, just enough for Colonel Reeve, who had been sitting silent, and still through the entire exchange, watching the way he'd watched Vane work the room days before from that same back row seat, to rise slowly to his feet. I have something to add, Reeve said. And the room, which had listened to plenty of men speak that evening, went instantly, completely still for him in a way it hadn't quite managed for anyone else all night. Because in Larkspur County, when Augustus Reeve stood up to speak, men had long since learned it meant something worth the silence, every time. I spent yesterday at the county courthouse, Reeve said, pulling records going back 30 years, further than most of you have lived in this valley. I found 4 land transfers, prior to this one tonight, all following an identical pattern, plain as daylight once a man sits down and lines them up side by side. A Vane survey. A forced or forged transfer, shortly after. A widow, or a wounded man, or someone else, without the means to fight back in a courtroom. And every single time, without exception, the land in question sat on water nobody else knew was there. He lifted the papers in his hand for the whole room to see. One of those records concerns Magda Ansel, who stands in this room tonight, and who lost this very parcel to a forged signature 30 years ago at the hand of Cornelius Vane's own father. He turned, slow, deliberate, and looked directly at Vane across the crowded hall. Another concerns a man named Corbett, who lost his arm at Shiloh fighting for this entire country, and who died believing his own trembling hand had failed him, when in plain truth it was your family's hand that failed him first, and failed him on purpose. The silence in the room had turned into something with real weight to it now. Something a man could have leaned against, and trusted to hold him up. I did not fight a war, Reeve said, to come home and watch the same theft repeated on a woman who did nothing wrong except bid $25 on animals nobody else in this county wanted at any price. I will not stand behind this council's vote. And I would ask every man in this room, who still calls himself decent, to reconsider standing behind it either, before this night is through. Magda rose next, slow, leaning on her stick, and made her way to the front of the room, with the whole crowd parting for her, without being asked to, the way a crowd parts for something it has, without quite realizing it, already decided to respect. She laid her tin box on the table in front of the council. Opened it. Drew out papers gone brittle and yellow with 30 years of careful, patient keeping. My husband's claim, she said, filed proper, the very year we came to this county, with nothing but a wagon and each other. And here. She drew out a second paper, laid it beside the first, with steady hands. The transfer document your father used to take it from me. Look closely, Cornelius. Compare the 2 signatures side by side. I have looked at them every single night for 30 years. I know every last difference between them the way I know the back of my own two hands. Vane didn't move to look. Didn't need to. Something in his face had already collapsed inward, the particular collapse of a man who understands, all at once, and all the way through, that the ground he'd built his whole careful strategy on had just given way completely beneath his feet. "This is ancient history," he said, but the words came out thin. Unconvincing, even to himself, even in his own ears. "It has nothing whatsoever to do with tonight's business." "It has everything to do with tonight's business," Reeves said, quiet, final, the kind of final that doesn't invite argument. "Because tonight's business is whether this council trusts Cornelius Vane's judgment about who deserves to keep their own water. And I would suggest, gentlemen, that a family, with 30 years of practice taking water from women who couldn't fight back is not a family whose judgment this county ought to trust with any water at all, not one drop of it." The 3 council members who'd voted with Vane sat very still, sweating now in a heat that had nothing whatsoever to do with July anymore. One of them, a heavy-set man named Purdy, who ran the feed store, was the first to find his own voice again. "I think," Purdy said, slow, like each word cost him something dear to say, "we ought to revisit last night's vote. Right here, right now, before we go another day carrying it." "Seconded," said the man beside him, fast, plainly relieved to finally have somewhere decent to put his own discomfort. The third abstained from speaking at all, which in that room, at that particular moment, was its own kind of vote, and everyone present understood it as such. Vane stood at the front, alone now in every way that mattered, watching a room he'd fully controlled just 1 hour earlier turn slowly, completely, unmistakably away from him. "This is a mistake," he said, but nobody in the room was listening to him anymore, and the particular horror of that, a man built entirely out of persuasion, discovering all at once that his persuasion had simply stopped working on anyone, was written plain across his face for every last person present to see clearly. He gathered what dignity he had left, which wasn't much by that point, and walked out of that hall through a crowd that parted for him not out of respect, the way it had parted for Reeve, and for Magda not 20 minutes before, but out of the particular contempt a small town saves up for a man finally caught, in front of everyone, being exactly what half of them had suspected he was all along. The council voted again, before the meeting closed that night. Unanimous, this time, in the other direction entirely. The emergency ordinance rescinded, struck from the record. The water declared, plainly and finally, to remain Winnie Sutter's own, to do with precisely as she judged fit, with no further interference from the council, or the bank, or anybody else claiming to speak for the public good. Which left her standing at the front of that crowded hall, every eye in the county fixed on her the same way every eye had been fixed on her at that auction 8 months before, back in the dead heart of January. Except this time, the eyes didn't carry a trace of mockery. They carried something closer to hope. Raw, exposed, and entirely dependent on whatever she chose to say next, standing there in front of all of them. She thought of the drought outside, still gripping the whole valley. Of wells gone dry, from one end of the county to the other. Of the particular fear she'd seen on every single face in that room, fear that had nothing to do with her personally, and everything to do with the summer that refused stubbornly to end. She could have made herself rich that night. Could have named a price that would have bought her children a future no one in this county could have argued against, with a straight face, and not one soul in that hall would have blamed her for it, not after everything they'd just watched Vane try to do to her. She thought of 80 starving hogs in a January pen. Of a town that had laughed, while she counted out her last $25 in worn silver. Of Magda's dry, cool hands pressing burdock root into her palm months ago, certain of something Winnie hadn't yet had the strength left in her to believe. "The water is available to every family in this valley," she said. Her voice carried, clear and steady, all the way to the very back of the hall. 1 barrel per family per day. The price is 5 cents a barrel, enough to cover the labor of keeping the well maintained properly, and Jasper Cobb's wage for helping manage the line, because that boy has earned every single cent of it twice, over this summer alone. The water itself is not for sale. It was never mine to sell in the first place. It's a gift the ground gave up to 80 animals nobody else in this county wanted, and I will not turn a gift like that into a business built on other people's thirst. The silence that followed was the deepest of the entire evening. Then a farmer near the front, a man whose own well had gone dry a full week before, whose face had carried nothing but grim endurance since the moment he'd walked into that hall, slowly took off his hat. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with something he clearly hadn't expected to feel that night. Another man nodded. Then another. The hostility that had hung over that room all summer long, all the quiet resentment of watching one family thrive, while the rest of the valley slowly withered around them, dissolved into something Winnie hadn't expected, and wasn't entirely sure, in that first stunned moment, how to receive gracefully. Gratitude. Plain and total, and entirely undeserved, by her own quiet reckoning, for simply doing the one thing that had seemed, to her, like the only decent thing left standing to do. The days that followed took on a shape none of them could have predicted 8 months before, standing in a frozen auction yard watching a woman count out her last $25. A line formed at Winnie's gate each morning, buckets and barrels waiting patient in the early light, Jasper directing traffic, with the self-important seriousness of a boy who'd been handed real responsibility for the first time in his young life, and intended to honor every last ounce of it. Children splashed in the overflow trough, while their mothers filled barrels, and their fathers, for the first time in weeks, allowed themselves a full, unguarded breath. Nathaniel came every day too, working the fence line, without pay, without being asked to, the particular penance of a man determined to earn back trust one fence rail at a time, one honest day's work after another. Colonel Reeve rode up more than once, that first week, not out of any real need of his own. His own creek pools had begun, slowly, to recover as the water table steadied across the whole valley, but because, he told Winnie plainly one evening, standing at her gate, with his hat in his hand, he'd found himself wanting to be near whatever it was she'd managed to build here. "I buried men," he said, "who never got the chance to see something like this happen in their own lifetime. A wrong made right, by people brave enough to stand up in front of a whole town, and say so out loud, whatever it cost them personally." He looked out at the line of neighbors filling their barrels, at the green hillside behind them, at Jasper directing the whole flow of it, with total, gap-toothed authority. It does something to a man, watching it happen. I didn't expect that, riding up here the first time. Magda came too, most afternoons, and sat on the old foundation stones of her mother's hearth, with a cup of something warm cradled in both hands, watching the basin she'd once called home fill slowly, day by day, with the sound of children laughing, and neighbors thanking her for a gift she hadn't given, but had, in her own quiet and long-suffering way, made possible after 30 years of carrying a truth nobody had asked to hear. "The land knows its own business," she said to Winnie one evening, watching the sun go down gold and heavy over the ridge. "I told you this, the very first night, and you did not fully believe me then, not really. Do you believe me now?" "I believe you," Winnie said, and found, to her own genuine surprise, that she meant it completely, all the way through. Cornelius Vane left Larkspur County, before the month was out. Nobody saw him go. He simply wasn't at the bank one morning, and the next week a man, from the state banking office arrived to review the ledgers, quiet and thorough, in response to a formal complaint filed jointly by Colonel Augustus Reeve and Magda Ansell, backed by 30 years of carefully kept papers, and the sworn statement of a man named Nathaniel Cobb, who stood in front of that state examiner and told the whole truth, without once looking away from him. What became of Vane exactly, the county never fully agreed on. Some said he'd gone east. Some said west, to try his particular talents on some other county that hadn't yet learned to see clean through them. Winnie found, turning it over in the quiet of her own evenings, that she didn't much care either way, one direction or the other. He had stopped, the moment that council reversed its vote in front of the whole town, being the shape of her fear. And a man who's stopped being your fear isn't worth much more thought than that, however much space he'd once taken up in her chest. By late August, the drought broke the way droughts sometimes do, not gently, not gradually, but all at once, a hard 3-day rain, that turned the county road to mud, and filled the creek back to its banks, and left every farmer in the valley standing out in their own yards, with their faces turned straight up to a sky that had finally relented after weeks of refusing them anything at all. Winnie stood on her own porch, Caleb and Mabel beside her, watching the rain come down over ground that had already, weeks before it was strictly necessary, given her family everything they needed to survive, and then some. "Mama!" Caleb's voice, small beside her. "Are we rich now?" She looked down at him. At Mabel, asleep against her hip despite the noise of the storm, thumb in her mouth, entirely unbothered, as she'd been unbothered by every single crisis this whole long year had thrown at their small family. "We're not rich," Winnie said, slow, choosing the words with real care, because some answers matter more to get right than others, especially the ones your own children will carry with them. "We're something better than rich. We're the family that had nothing anybody else wanted, and turned it into something the whole valley needed." Caleb considered that, with the same seriousness Jasper had once considered the naming of a sow. "That's better," he decided, nodding once satisfied. "I think so too." She thought sometimes, in the quiet hours, after the children were asleep, about the woman she'd been standing in that auction yard 8 months before. Gray shawl. $25. A whole town's laughter following her home like a shadow she couldn't outrun no matter how fast she walked. She didn't recognize that woman anymore, not fully. Not the way you don't fully recognize a photograph of yourself taken during the very worst year of your life, familiar, but distant, a stranger wearing your own face, and none of your current understanding. She was not, whatever Cornelius Vane had once called her in front of a laughing crowd, a woman alone. She never really had been, not from the very first night an old woman, with dry, cool hands had walked up out of the dusk, and told her, plain and certain, to stop listening to the town, and start listening to the pigs instead. She had listened. And the land, exactly as Magda had promised her, that first cold night, had spoken back. Loud enough, in the end, for the whole valley to hear it too.